Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest talk at the National Library of Scotland. I'm Ralph McLean, the Curator of Manuscripts for the long 18th century at the library, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Leith Davis of Simon Fraser University, who will be talking today on Networking Jacobites and the Lyon and Mourning manuscript of Robert Forbes. Leith is the author of a number of works, including Acts of Union, Scotland and the Negotiation of the British Nation, published in 1998, and Robert Burns and Transatlantic Culture, published in 2012. Leith is currently co-editing with Janet Sorensen, the International Companion to Scottish Literature of the long 18th century, and her most recent book, published this year in fact, is Mediating Cultural Memory in Britain and Ireland, from the 1688 Revolution to the 1745 Rebellion. I'm also very pleased to say that Leith has recently been successful with a funding bid on Networking Jacobites, which will see further research into the Lyon and Mourning manuscripts and their availability in a freely accessible and fully digitised format. The National Library of Scotland is a partner in this project, and I and my colleagues very much look forward to working with Leith over the coming months. I'm especially pleased about securing this funding after Leith and I successfully navigated the 10th circle of hell, otherwise known as the application process for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Now, originally, our plan was for this talk to coincide with the launch of the library's Treasures Gallery, where one of the manuscript volumes of the Lyon and Mourning was to be one of the first treasures out on display. But sadly, this has been delayed, no prizes for guessing why. So hopefully this talk will instead whet the appetite and have people champing at the bit to see it on show next spring. Now, just before I hand over to Leith, for anyone that would like to ask a question during the talk or after, please do so by entering it into the Q&A function, and we will put those questions to Leith at the end of our talk. And so without further ado, I'll pass you over to Professor Leith Davis talking on Networking Jacobites and the Lyon and Mourning manuscript of Robert Forbes.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ralph. And I also want to just acknowledge before I start that I'm joining you today from unceded Coast Salish territory on the west coast of North America. So these are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I am a settler scholar here and grateful to be living and working on these lands. It is an absolute pleasure to join you today to discuss this amazing manuscript. And I hope that many of the people joining us have been able to see the manuscript for yourselves. For those who haven't had a chance to see it, hopefully my talk will convince you to go to the National Library of Scotland's exhibit coming up in the spring. My own relationship with this manuscript comes from a research trip that I made in December 2019. So that was just before COVID made working in archives impossible and changed all our lives in so many ways. I was finishing up the work for my forthcoming book, and it's forthcoming actually next year. And I was completely amazed by this manuscript. It has become somewhat of an obsession ever since. So I'm very happy that I have this opportunity to share this obsession with you and tell you about this manuscript and about the project that we are embarking on that Ralph was discussing. So just give me a minute here as I share my screen. And hopefully you're all able to see the PowerPoint presentations. And if that's not the case, Ralph, just interrupt me and tell me that I need to adjust something, but hopefully you can all see the title slide here, Networking Jacobites, the Lyon and Mourning manuscript of Robert Forbes. So my talk today is divided into 5 parts, and I want to start by outlining the historical context of the Lyon and Mourning for those of you who may not be familiar with the manuscript. This will lead into describing a bit about the contents of the Lyon and Mourning, and it's a very complex manuscript, so I'm just giving you a sneak preview of some of the delights that it contains. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the manuscript, and it really is an amazing story about how we were able to to view this manuscript today through basically chance as it came to the National Library of Scotland. And then I'll move into telling you about the Lyon and Mourning project, the Digital Humanities project, and the partnership project that Ralph was mentioning. I will be able to discuss a little bit of the research results so far of this project and tell you about the anticipated findings. And just to give you an overview of the project, that our intent with this is to shed new light on the manuscript for academic and general audiences, to make it more available for scholars and wider audience to use and peruse. We're using a qualitative analysis that's qualitative and quantitative. So, and this is a combination, and I want to emphasize that this is not just crunching numbers, but we are, with our research questions, also embarking on analysis. And ultimately, we're using this manuscript to produce a new understanding of Jacobite networks after 1746, and also to understand the shaping of Jacobites in cultural memory. So let's look a little bit at the historical context of this manuscript. It's compiled by one man, Robert Forbes, and he was the son of a schoolmaster in Aberdeen. He was educated at Marshall College in Aberdeen, and he became an Episcopalian clergyman in Leith. He would later go on to become Bishop of Ross and Caithness after 1762, and he was a Jacobite. And like many Jacobites, his life was changed completely by the events that unfolded over the summer and fall of 1745 and the early years of 1746, during what would be the final rising of the Jacobites. It was a tumultuous time, and as the story goes, on July 23rd, 1745, Charles Edward Stewart landed on the remote Hebridean island of Eriskay with 7 of his followers. He began gathering together his army for this attempt, yet another attempt, to seize the throne back for the Stuarts. Now, Forbes, being an eager Jacobite, set out to join the troops, the Jacobite troops, but instead he was arrested at St. Ninians. He was held captive first in Stirling Castle from September 1745. And then he was transferred to Edinburgh Castle in February 1746. And it's possible there that he conceived the idea of compiling this manuscript because he seems to have listened attentively to the stories of his fellow prisoners. Meanwhile, while Forbes is in prison, the Jacobite army is marching into England. They turn back December 4th, 1745, and the ill-fated Battle of Culloden, ill-fated for Jacobites, Battle of Culloden occurs on April 16th, 1746. Now, amazingly, Forbes was released in May 1746, so the month after the Battle of Culloden. And he took up residence at that point in Leith again, living at the Citadel. And this was an old Cromwellian tower that had served as housing. He was staying in the residence of Lady Bruce there. The context in which Forbes was living, second, disengaging phone, sorry about that. The context in which Forbes was living is, as Marie Pittock calls it, a criminalized world. So this is a time of imprisonment, transportation, execution of Jacobites, and official prohibitions against Highland culture. So sympathizing, aiding, and abetting Jacobites, collecting their stories was dangerous. Nevertheless, Forbes began documenting the Jacobite experience. So collecting the stories of men and women who had been part of the Jacobite cause up to that point. He wrote out 10 volumes between the years 1747 and 1775, and 8 of those happened in the first 5 years. So the first 5 years after the Battle of Culloden, Forbes is furiously writing, collecting all the kind of information that he can about the experiences. In total, the Lyon and Mourning manuscript is 10 volumes, 2,148 pages, all in the handwriting of Robert Forbes. And here you can see his signature there. He included his signature after almost every entry. Robert Forbes, AM, Artium Magister. The manuscript itself is remarkable, and you can see from these images here, Forbes is styling his manuscripts very much as books. So he includes elaborate title pages with epigraphs here, with volume numbers. And at the end of each volume, he also includes tables of contents. So going back and compiling and making these searchable with these table of contents. He uses organizational strategies too, cross-references, footnotes, and it really is like 18th century hyperlinks because he connects the different stories with his footnotes, obviously going back, reading them, thinking about how they relate to other items in the book that have come previously. All right, so that's describing to you the context, historical context of how Robert Forbes came to write this incredible manuscript. And I'd like to do a little bit of a dive into the contents next. So again, just emphasizing these are over 2,000 pages, very miscellaneous material, but I'm going to pull out some of the items that I think are worth dwelling in, as I say, providing a preview of the contents for you. Forbes seems to have started off being very interested in collecting the dying speeches of the Jacobites who suffered as a result of the 1745 rising. So one of the first items in volume 1 is the last and dying speech of Robert Lyon, AM, presbyter at Perth, who was executed at Penrith on October 28th, 1746. And what Forbes is doing is collecting the speeches in order to memorialize the people who have passed in the Jacobite cause. So these speeches were common, last dying speeches. Prisoners had the opportunity to address the crowd, and dying speeches were often printed and distributed a bit like Netflix crime shows back in the 18th century. In the case of the speeches of Jacobite prisoners who were executed, these prisoners confirmed their belief in the righteousness of the Stewart cause. So here is Forbes collecting these speeches, re-emphasizing the importance and the continuity of the Jacobite cause. A couple of other examples here. He collects even 2 iterations of the speech of the Right Honorable Arthur Lord Balmerino. He was one of the Jacobite peers who was executed. And one of these Forbes notes is ostensibly from Balmerino's own handwrit. So one was a printed copy, probably distributed. One, as Forbes notes, was from the Lord's own handwriting. Another genre of items that Forbes collect is testimonies. And he's interested in finding out the experience of not just the well-known actors, but also anybody who was involved in the 1745 rising. So he collects and records the testimony of one Mrs. Robertson, Lady Inches. This is from Tuesday afternoon, October 25th. Forbes met with Mrs. Robertson, was introduced to her by Miss Cameron. They came to the Citadel, and Forbes records the following. On Friday after the Battle of Culloden, April 18th, she went home to her house called the Lees, within a mile or so at the field of battle. Upon the road, as she went along, she saw heaps of dead bodies, stripped naked and lying above the ground. And this is just one of the scenes that Mrs. Robertson records, but Forbes takes down everything in minute detail. He gives us as well written testimony by one William Jack, and this was passed on to Forbes by George Innes on February 27th. And Innes remarks about William Jack's style, though his style be none of the best, I choose to give you it in his own words. This is actually from a letter that William Jack wrote to his friends. And he tells his friends in this letter, this comes to acquaint you, I was 8 months and 8 days at sea, of which time I was 8 weeks upon a half and a pound and 12 ounces oatmeal and a bottle of water in the 24 hours. Now, Jack also notes that there were 157 prisoners put on board the prison ship, ironically called the Liberty and Property. But he notes when we came ashore, there were about 49 in life. So 157 prisoners, only 49 survived. Another record that Forbes takes down is oral testimony from Patrick Grant. And this is an interesting one because Forbes gathers this from a oral testimony, but he notes it's taken down from the mouth of Patrick Grant, commonly called Black Peter of Craskey, one of the famous Glenmoriston men, Donald MacLeod Taylor in Edinburgh, being interpreter, as the said Patrick Grant could speak nothing but Erse, and by that he means Gaelic. So Patrick Grant comes to the Citadel and he has an interpreter, a Donald MacDonald. He's speaking in Erse. Donald MacDonald is the one translating, and Forbes is writing down what Patrick Grant says. So we have several layers of mediation there, but an interesting scene where we can get a glimpse of this Gaelic speaking person who is interviewed by Forbes. There's a similar interviewing process that happens with Anne McKay. This interview was done by Frances Stewart and passed on to Forbes. And Anne McKay was a poor Isle of Skye woman who happened to be at Inverness the time of the Battle of Culloden. She helped an officer, Robert Nairn, escape, and she was later interrogated by Colonel Leighton. And in the testimony that Frances Stewart takes down, he actually tries to approximate her Gaelic accent in English, as she says when asked if she had drunk the health of Charles Edward Stewart. I know pe trink Charlie health I like to duke, for I pe MacLeod and the MacLeods know pe like Charlie. We don't like Prince Charles, we like the Duke of Cumberland, she says. So again, an interesting remediation here done that gives us a glimpse of her words, obviously heavily remediated, but nevertheless, it is a window into the words of Anne McKay and her experiences. Interestingly enough, Forbes also seeks the names of those who showed mercy. So he's not just collecting stories of atrocities. As he says, now I wish I had the name of the said dragoon. This was a man who saved the life of a lame man. For 'tis pity the few good should not be recorded. And that's a really interesting moment. So we see Forbes here reflecting not just those people who inflicted cruelty on the Jacobites, but those who also showed mercy and helped them despite not having the same political beliefs. I want to emphasize as well Forbes' own sense of the importance of his work. And this is from a letter to Mr. James Hay. He says, looking forward, in the event of a history, the recording of proper names, surnames, will prove mighty useful in order to strengthen and fix the facts in opposition to all contradiction and cavilling. As in a point of fact, one can never be too strict and nice. You can never get your facts straight enough, he says, especially in an age when even glaring facts are most impudently denied and contradicted with the greatest boldness. Again, an interesting concept from Forbes here as he's anticipating the future recording of the Jacobite Rising in 1745 and believing that it won't be recorded accurately because history is written by those who are in the driving seat. Another variety of account that Forbes collects concerns the escape of Charles Edward Stewart after the Battle of Culloden. After the battle, Charles Edward Stewart ranged from the highlands and islands all over, basically trying to evade capture by government troops. And Forbes is fascinated by this account, these adventures, and he endeavors to interview everybody he can who was involved in helping Charles Edward Stewart in his evasion. And this is quite a remarkable story because there was a £30,000 reward for Charles Edward Stewart at this point. Remarkably, nobody turned him in, and Forbes includes that details of people saying it wasn't worth the reward was not worth losing their honor. He gathers together then oral interviews and written accounts by as many people as he can find who were involved in this. And he attempts to collate these accounts, trying to figure out the accurate story of Charles Edward Stewart's escape. He includes the journal taken from the mouth of Flora MacDonald, for example. This was taken down by Dr. Burton of York when he was in Edinburgh. Flora MacDonald was on a prison ship in Leith for a number of months, and Burton took down her story. Forbes also passes on written questions to Miss MacDonald for her to answer. And of course, Flora MacDonald famously disguised the prince as her waiting maid, Betty Burke, and helped him to go from Benbecula to Skye disguised as this maid with a passport given by Flora's father, Hugh MacDonald of Armadale. We also have in the Lyon and Mourning really interesting testimony of the journal of Captain Alexander MacDonald. Now, Alexander MacDonald, of course, is become the famous Gaelic poet, Alistair MacFester Alistair. And Forbes interviews him on a number of occasions. So we have here an account of Captain Alexander MacDonald's accompanying the prince. And MacDonald also relates the later destruction of his own lands as a result of his involvement with the Jacobite cause. In addition to these characters who are perhaps more familiar to us today, Forbes also includes a number of accounts of ordinary men and women. And just to give you a couple of examples of this, he includes the journal of Donald MacLeod of Galtergill, of the prince's escape, and of his own fortunes after Culloden. And MacLeod was an honest and faithful steersman of the 8-oared boat, notes Forbes, who had the prince among his hands for 9 or 10 weeks after the Battle of Culloden. And MacLeod here becomes an important witness, and whose testimony Forbes is particularly interested in recording and also collating with the other accounts that he collects. Interestingly enough, we also have an account of the Journal of Edward or Ned Burke, chairman in Edinburgh. So Burke was a sedan chair carrier in Edinburgh. He became the servant to one of Charles Edward Stewart's aide-de-camp, and also the guide for Charles Edward Stuart after the Battle of Culloden. Forbes notes, as he's taking down Ned's account, that he was near 30 years old before he could speak a word of English. So the account is in English. Ned is clearly speaking to Forbes in English, but it's interesting that Forbes notes that this is not his mother tongue. And Forbes says it necessarily means taking what he says with a bit of a grain of salt. Interesting that we see Forbes' own attitude towards Gaelic speakers here. Another genre that Forbes is eager to record are letters. And he is a prolific letter keeper, letter sender. So these letters involve letters that are sent to other people and then passed on to Forbes. For example, the Lyon in Mourning actually begins with a copy of the letter from the Reverend Mr. Lyon to his mother and sisters. And this is the letter that Lyon wrote before he was executed, with the knowledge that he would soon be executed, and passing on to his mother and to his sisters his advices and also his love. It's a very moving letter. Forbes also includes letters that he sends out and copies of the replies to his letters. So, for example, we have a copy of a letter to the Right Reverend Bishop Robert Gordon of London, and the flip side of that, the copy of a paragraph from Robert Gordon of London, a kind of response there. In fact, volumes 9 and 10 of the Lyon in Mourning include mostly letter excerpts, and they appear almost as dialogues between Forbes and Gordon. So we have Forbes sending to Gordon information about what's happening in Edinburgh, Gordon respectively sending back to Forbes information about London. And there's a dialogue that takes place. We find out a lot about the cultural and political situation of Edinburgh through these letters. Forbes writes to Bishop Gordon on March 2nd, 1773, for example, "The world is gone a-madding. We are plagued with a sad gypsy from your metropolis, Mrs. Yates, who acts many out of their senses." This was an actress who had come to Edinburgh. "We have had a masquerade in Edinburgh, the first that has ever yet been in Scotland, and may we never have another, say I." So Forbes clearly not approving of the theater, the playhouse there. Forbes also writes to Bishop Gordon, and this is almost one of the last entries of the Lyon in Mourning. "Things in America are turning out more and more serious." This is July 14th, 1775. "And as you justly say, God only knows where they will end." And it is interesting that the Lyon in Mourning starts with one rising and ends at the beginning of the next rising, the American Rising or the American Revolution. Now, these letters are extremely important information. As Gary Schneider suggests, early modern letters are crucial material bearers of social connection, instruments by which social ties were initiated, negotiated, and consolidated. So they are a goldmine of information. And I'll be talking about that later on when I discuss the project. Again, the contents are extremely varied. So Forbes collects songs and poems as well. And just to give you a couple of examples of these, he collects "By a Lady Upon the Ribbon," which the prince wore about his head when obliged to disguise himself in female dress under the name of Betty Burke. So we have there a kind of panegyric on the prince. as well as the comic A Song to the Tune of a Cobbler. There are also Latin poems and Latin poems as well as English poems and the translations of those poems. Other materials, well, there are periodicals written out by Forbes. There's an amazing list of provisions from James Gibb, who was master of the household to Charles Edward Stewart. And there are epitaphs, and you can see from this image how Forbes has actually written out the epitaph, turned the page, written out the epitaph so it approximates the writing upon a stone. In addition to the items that Forbes writes out in his handwriting, he also includes 2 printed texts that he binds with the manuscripts. And these are the Communion Office that was used by Robert Lyon, so that in the early volume 1, this appears between Robert Lyon's letter to his mother and sisters and his dying speech. And then at the end of volume 8, there is this interesting pamphlet called Alexis, or The Young Adventurer, a novel. And this contains many of the stories in secret history form that Forbes was trying to find out in his history, the escape of the prince, quote unquote, Charles Edward Stewart, as he's making his way around the Highlands and Islands. In addition, Forbes pastes certain items onto the front and back boards of the volumes. So we have on volume 3 a piece of the prince's garter and fabric from the Betty Burke gown and apron. On the backboard of volume 4, we have pieces of that identical 8-oared boat, on board of which Donald MacLeod, etc., set out from Borodale with the prince. And these are artifacts of material culture. As Neil Guthrie suggests, these objects are made sacred and distinct from ordinary commodities through their association with the Stewart. So they are like relics that Forbes includes in his volumes. Okay, so that was just to give you a brief glimpse of the number of miscellaneous items that Forbes includes. And just to emphasize, he records these not in chronological order, but in order in which they come to him. So he filters all that information through his own consciousness and shares it as well. He notes on a number of occasions reading out the items from the manuscript. Okay, how did the National Library of Scotland come to obtain this amazing manuscript? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the history. The manuscript, obviously not published in Forbes's lifetime. He decided not to, even after the indemnity. He says, "I keep my collection in concealment always, so that I'm not afraid of its being seized by enemies, and it is not every friend I allow to see only the bulk and outside of my favorite papers." Very much aware he's keeping them to himself, although he does share episodes and he reads out from the volumes for meetings that he has at the Citadel. In 1806, these manuscript volumes were passed to Henry Stewart of Allenton. Allenton was going to put together a history of the Rising. He didn't manage to because of ill health, but he did compile an index, and this is cataloged as a volume 11 in the National Library of Scotland. And it's basically, he takes the table of contents from Forbes' own volumes and he writes them out as a separate volume. The manuscripts and this index were given to Robert Chambers in 1832, and Chambers actually used sections of the Lyon and Mourning and published them in his Jacobite memoirs of the Rebellion of 1745 and the revised version of History of the Rebellion of 1745 to 6. Chambers also left the Lyon and Mourning, all the volumes, to the Advocates Library out of gratitude for using the library's resources. There is also a printed version that was done of the Lyon and Mourning. This was done in 1895 to 6. It was produced by the Scottish History Society and edited by Henry Peyton. It's a 3-volume edition, so it reduces the 10 volumes to 3, and it represents them as a printed volume. So you can see here, each item separated. You lose the sense of the manuscript in the process. And scholars, with certain exceptions, such as Vicky Coltman, Murray Pittock, have used primarily this printed version. As a result, the Lyon and Mourning itself has become what I call an occluded manuscript. So the manuscript has taken a backseat to the printed version. In printed form, the Lyon and Mourning is used primarily as a source, has been used up to this point as a historical source. And historians coming down on different sides of the question of how accurate it is. So C.L. Kingford suggesting it's a prejudiced source, and it's hearsay, scandal, and fustian rhetoric, and is not to be credited. That's in 1922. More recently, Michael Lynch suggests it's the work of an Episcopalian propagandist. On the other hand, there are scholars such as Alan McInnes, who commends the unstinting efforts of Robert Forbes and suggests that Forbes's accounts can be corroborated by the Loudon papers. This occlusion, as I suggest, has resulted in our loss of understanding about the manuscript itself. So we lose a sense of Forbes as this individual representative of collective memory. And we lose a sense of the representation of embodied knowledge. This was a man who devoted his life to writing out by hand the accounts of the Jacobites. Which brings me to the Lyon and Mourning Networking Jacobites project. Our project is designed to restore awareness of the work as a manuscript. And we are also going to use qualitative and quantitative analysis to produce a new fine-grained understanding of Jacobite networks after 1746. So important here then, we're viewing the Lyon and Mourning, the manuscript, as a modern medium. This technology is a contemporary medium in the 18th century. Yes, important for secrecy, but it's also a convenient information technology for Forbes. It's an adaptable form that he can change, and it stretches out as he makes it stretch out through volumes. And the reading out of the volumes also enabled networking and connection for Jacobites after 1746. So it's not just a historical record, it's actually creating networks in the 18th century after 1746. And I just want to reference here, connect this to recent work that's being done on book history scholarship by scholars such as Rachel Scarborough-King, who suggests that instead of being outmoded, handwritten texts were essential to 18th century literature, politics, religion, business, and everyday life. So central that they are at times paradoxically almost invisible because they were taken for granted by contemporaries. So we want to restore the Lyon and Mourning to visibility as a manuscript, a contemporary medium. The work has evolved in 3 stages. It began with an Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities Digital Research Fellowship. Very grateful to them, as well as Simon Fraser University's Digital Humanities Innovation Lab and the National Library of Scotland. And through combined efforts, we were able to digitize and display the manuscript in May 2021. So if you go to Simon Fraser University's digitized collections, you can actually see the individual volumes and the pages of the manuscript. The entire thing is there now. I will say it is a bit clunky to navigate, and we are going to be changing the navigational technology so that it'll be much easier to make your way around the manuscript. We also, at that point, began to create a multidisciplinary international network of Networking Jacobite colleagues. And these are colleagues who are working on many different areas: Gallic, trauma studies, material culture, tourism studies, archival studies, and media studies. So the aim is to expand the reach of Jacobite studies into a range of different disciplines. The project was given a further infusion of funds in summer 2021, again with a Simon Fraser University's DHIL grant, as well as the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada Insight grant. And with those funds, we were able to work with user interface developer from the DHIL, Joey Takeda, who's done an absolutely brilliant work developing the methodology for the project. So the project combines text encoding initiative with the creation of files on persons, places, and objects. Those of you who aren't familiar with text encoding initiative, it's a coding system for the representation of text in digital form. And we're also creating these files for each person, place, and object. And these files will include gender, language, occupation, place of residence, religious affiliation, organizational affiliation. We are georeferencing the place files, and we are also tracking the material cultural artifacts connected with the Stewarts that are mentioned in the Jacobite, in the Lyon and Mourning. Over the summer, we also amassed a fantastic team. So a student team who have been trained now in TEI coding, and a huge shout out to Jasmine Bojakli, Taylor Breckles, Alyssa Bridgman, Caitlin McKinnock, who are doing amazing work for us. And finally, in the fall, just a few weeks ago, the grant that Ralph mentioned, the Partnership Engage grant. So an official partnership now between the National Library of Scotland, SFU's Centre for Scottish Studies, SFU's Digital Humanities Innovation Lab. And this recent funding then will enable us to expand the project and include further mobilization of the results. So let me just conclude with the last section of this talk by telling you a little bit about the research that we have done so far and where we intend to go with it. So far, we have done the TI encoding of volume 11. So that is the index that Stewart created. And that has given us a sense of the landscape of the entire Lyon and Mourning. Joey Takeda has created separate TI files for each entry. And we've also embarked on the person files and place files for the index. And thank you, huge shout out to Caitlin, who is wrangling all the McDonald's and the various characters who appear in the Lyon and Mourning. The RAs have also begun creating metadata for the files. And for me as a literary scholar who is a media historian, I'm particularly interested in letters, roots of those letters, book sense, et cetera, et cetera. So the RAs are extracting that information. And Joey Takeda has also created an amazing navigation system between the texts. So we can go between Forbes's printed volumes and, Forbes's manuscript volume and Peyton's printed volumes. And we have a way of navigating the various number systems that we have been coming up against. In terms of what we have so far, remember we've just done TO encoding of the titles of these individual items. So we can see already, however, in this graph, the breakdown, titles that include male names, 365, female names, 52, and there are 30 that are not identifiable. We can also see the breakdown of the genre of documents. So we can see here from this graph, letters by far and away the most number of items in the Lyon and Mourning, followed by accounts or narratives, poems, songs, conversations, miscellaneous speeches, and 2 inserts. Now in future, TEI encoding of the rest of the volumes will allow us to analyze even closer these networks of people, places, letters, texts, objects, and also to map chronological and geographical connections between people and objects. We'll be able to extract more granular information, like who mentioned whom in their narratives, who gathered together the Jacobite cause, where, how often, as Forbes records this. To whom did Forbes read out his accounts? Who wrote to whom? How did they send their letters? Just a couple quick examples here then. With an item like the following, there were present during this date that Forbes records witnesses who saw this conversation. Richard Seaman, Baxter, Baker, in Leith, John Hay, periwig maker, Mrs. Betty Seaman, and Mrs. Ellie Kendall. Now, we have here 4 silent witnesses, essentially, who we wouldn't know anything about apart from the fact that Forbes mentioned they were there. They will show up in the database. We will have person files for each of those. In terms of the letters and the roots, we can see in this example, as Forbes notes, I delivered the original of the preceding letter to Robert Chesser, staymaker in Edinburgh, to be by him carefully transmitted to James Bain Taylor in the Strand, London. So we'll be able to chase those roots and create a network of associations with a focus on mediation and ordinary men and women. Digital tools do indeed make it possible with relative ease and speed to measure the relationships between many entities in multiple ways, allowing a rich, multidimensional reading of complex systems never before possible. So just to finish then, I want to also just gesture towards the mobilization of findings, what we are going to do with these findings, and really intending to reach out to academic and general audiences. For academic audiences, we are planning a symposium, hopefully in the spring 2022 in Edinburgh, and a conference on networking Jacobites that I'm hoping to co-organize with my colleague at the University of Guelph, Kevin James, in August 2022. There will be hopefully a subsequent essay collection. In collaboration with the NLS, we're also creating a website featuring the manuscript with these stories, these individual stories of Gaelic speakers, women, non-aristocratic actors. And we are mobilizing this research digitally with blogs and podcasts with topics like prisoners of Ague, women of the Lyon and Mourning manuscript, etc. This is an example. This is done by our R.A. Taylor Breckles of a graphic novel version of one of the items included in the Lyon and Mourning. And of course, we can't forget in-person events. So just in early September, we presented stories from the Lyon and Mourning at the Scotfest BC Highland Games, accompanied by musical interludes that complemented the stories. And that wraps it up. So I want to just end by thanking you so much and inviting you, if you're interested in finding out more about the project, please do follow us. My email is there. Twitter account. And yes, the Lyon in Mourning has its own Twitter account. So please do follow us. And I should also mention, I need to also mention, the complimentary talk to this one will be done by Ralph McLean at the Vancouver St. Andrews Society annual lecture on November 20th. And if you'd like details on that, please do check out the Centre for Scottish Studies Facebook page, our Twitter, our Instagram, or our plain old website. So thank you so much for listening. And I am happy to take any questions that there might be.